Hello again, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture on Chapter 11, Qualitative Designs and Data Collection. In part 1 of our lecture here, we talked about the different research designs that come up with qualitative data and qualitative research. And in the second part of the lecture, we're really going to focus on the data collection piece because there are some components of data collection within qualitative designs that are pretty unique and some challenges that come with that are important to keep in mind when you are deciding to engage in qualitative research. So let's go ahead and get started. So when you are doing research in the field, researchers will encounter things that they have never encountered before. And details of those encounters need to be observed and recorded. But it's important to keep in mind that even when you are observing and recording that information, as human beings, we fall victim to the fact that we don't always notice everything that's going on around us. And sometimes we think about our own perceptions and how that can influence how we observe information, but also we're human and our memories fade and the details about what we observed can be lost or they can be invented. Our memories are not perfect, which can interfere with data collection in qualitative designs. To tackle these issues as researchers, we should become aware of things that can interfere with recording qualitative data. That means that if you're going to engage in qualitative data, you need to plan ahead based on your research design and the area of interest that you're researching and determine how you can make changes. So, for example, if you are doing a research study in a population that might have impairment in their memory, you are building in structure in your study to make sure that you're gathering that information. You're recording everything on video cameras, or everything has a transcript with it, which we'll talk a little bit more about in detail, but you're planning ahead. And sometimes researchers prefer to work in teams so that the records of multiple observers can be compared and reconciled. This cross-referencing of our notes and recollections with others is oftentimes called intersubjectivity. And in qualitative research, this intersubjectivity is our best shot at objectivity in the research that we're gathering. So when you're engaging in intersubjectivity, you have multiple researchers who are observing the same thing, and then you're comparing what each of you have observed and what notes you have taken about the behavior. And it's that combination of both components, both what I see and what you see and what every other researcher on the team sees, that you really come to a sense of, okay, this is probably objectively what happened. It's the closest we can get to that objectivity. And there are 3 types of ethnographic data: what people do, what they say about what they do, and what they think. And it is our job as researchers to aim to collect all 3 types of these data points, rather than relying on one and jumping to conclusions about the others, about what people say, what they do, or what they think. We really want to, in ethnographic qualitative data, collect all 3 forms of this data. And qualitative data can be collected in many ways. And 2 of the most prominent are participant observation and ethnographic interviews. So let's go into a little bit more detail on each of those. So participant observation is a strategic method that was developed by social scientists that considers the position of the researcher in relation to their research participants. So the whole study of participant observation is looking at how you as a researcher can observe your participants in a way that you become part of them without becoming part of them, which I know sounds weird, but the whole goal of participant observation is that you as the researcher, the participant observer, you try to maintain a position between participation and observation. If the balance between participant and observer is lost and the researcher drifts towards one extreme by turning into a participant without much observation, there's a fear that they are what in research they call going native, which means that the researcher is too accepting of the cultural norms and not distant enough from the social norms and cultural values of the community that they can't observe it. But we can also see the extreme in the other direction. If the researcher drifts too far towards the other extreme by observing without participating, there's a fear that the true dynamics of the people and the culture being studied are being missed by the researcher because they're not feeling it as the members of the community are experiencing it. So, as researchers, we should refrain from judging people on the traditions during the process of participant observation. The scientific process requires researchers to evaluate with as little bias as possible. And that means that when you are engaging in participant observation, you're going in with an open mind about what is going on without judgment and really getting a feel for how those communities are operating before you make any judgments about what is actually happening. And experiences and insights that are gained during participant observation should be documented in what we call field notes. And these field notes are descriptive and analytical notes at once. Because as a researcher, it's impossible for us to put our experience into language without sorting through a multitude of impressions first. So, field notes often include things like our observations of the community that we're observing, our reflections, or even memos to ourselves as a researcher that we can then reflect on after data collection has ended and really use that as a comprehensive way to understand a community. The other prominent design for qualitative data collection is the ethnographic interviews. And within the ethnographic interviews, this is again a form of qualitative interviews that requires three basic things. You have an interviewer, which is typically the researcher, an interviewee, which is sometimes called an informant, that's the member of the community in the community that you're researching, and an interview schedule or an outline that guides the process of the interview that you're engaging in. And ethnographic interviews are also sometimes called in-depth interviews because that's exactly what you're doing with an ethnographic interview. You are trying to get an in-depth, deep dive into what this interviewee's experience is like in the community that you're researching. You are trying to get what a day in their shoes is like. And when you are engaging in ethnographic interviews, they are neither structured nor unstructured. Ethnographic interviews are called semi-structured because we as researchers have an outline of prepared questions, but those questions are oftentimes open-ended and flexible. And informants can respond in their own words and at varying lengths. So as a researcher, we have the opportunity to ask follow-up questions that might not be in the outline of like, tell me a little bit more about what you mean when you said this. Or I don't know if I'm following you. Can you go into a little bit more detail here? So we call it semi-structured because you have that outline, but you're not bound to only the questions in the outline. You can expand as the interviewer, and your interviewee can be more flexible. And other interviews are considered informal, meaning they are casual conversations without a guiding list of questions, but that may be informative and can be remembered and written down later. So this is like a subset of ethnographic interviews where they're completely informal, where you're just like walking down the street collecting participant observation and you happen to stop and talk to someone. And you're not asking them specific questions, but you're getting important information from them. So it's a casual conversation, and then you leave that conversation and say, hey, I want to remember that and have some of that detail for my study, and you write it down after. That's more of that informal ethnographic interview. So when you're engaging in ethnographic interviews, it's really incredibly important to take written notes during the interview. But it's important to also keep in mind that if you have consent from the participant, it's also important and helpful to audio or video record the interview that you're engaging in. After the interview has occurred, the next step in ethnographic interviews and in qualitative data is for you to transcribe the voice to text of that interview so that you can keyword search the original interview data as well as take notes or as well as the notes that were taken during the interview and jump right into your qualitative analysis. So when you transcribe information, we'll talk more about this in our lecture on chapter 12, but you're taking word for word what was said in the interview and you are putting it in written form so that when you are doing your data analysis, you can start to look for themes, you can look for patterns, you can look for any way that you want to categorize what was being said, and you can do so by searching instead of having to rewatch your video every time you want to call a piece of data from it. And really, when you're transcribing, you are moving away from collecting data to analyzing the data because oftentimes you're starting to notice patterns automatically and just naturally as you transcribe data. When you're doing an ethnographic interview, the number of informants needed for that study will depend on the research design that you're engaging in. If the purpose of your interview is to learn about a culture or an organization or the attributes of a group of people, you could gain a lot of information from relatively few key informants who happen to be very knowledgeable about the community. So if that is the purpose of your design, to get this in-depth information about the community, you don't need as many participants because you're going to have a few key informants that are going to give you the information that you need. In other cases, research requires interviews with a group of cultural experts who will guide the researcher through the interview, will give you more information about the community that you're engaging or the organization that you're researching so that you can get in-depth information about them. So when you're doing this research, you might need more participants because each member of that community is going to have a different culture towards that community. And it's also important to consider the variations in both types of research, but primarily within ethnographic studies, because ethnographic interviews can be conducted in multiple ways. Namely, you can have an ethnographic interview that can be conducted with individuals or with groups of individuals. So when you are doing group interviews that promise to yield additional data, this gives you an opportunity to put individual data in perspective. So you might have individual studies, but then you're going to go out and you're going to do maybe a group study as well, where you've met someone and you've met them independently, and now you want to see how they are at home with their family members, how they operate at work around their coworkers. And this type of group interview gives you as a researcher an opportunity to operationalize the data that you gained in individual interviews and to put it in context for that person. Because from that sort of change in environment, you as a researcher can draw direct comparisons among members of the group. It could also make sense to collect individual data and cultural data so that attributes of individuals can be understood in the context of the attributes of their culture. So this can include taking note of cultural customs, rituals, behaviors, so that when you're collecting individual data, you can put it in the context of the entire environment. And another option is to engage in a focus group. And a focus group is an interview of a group of people who don't know each other but occupy the same position. So a good example of this is if you are trying to do an ethnographic or qualitative study about graduate students, you might do a focus group of all graduate students, but none of them know each other. They might be graduate students from different programs, from even different schools, and they become your focus group. And you as a researcher lead a discussion amongst them and get this sort of focused discussion on your topic of interest from these people who are in the same occupation but are unknown to one another. A key component of data collection that you engage in when you're doing qualitative data is data management. because it is a considerable component of qualitative data collection, because you as a researcher will be managing upwards of hundreds of documents of data if you're engaging in qualitative research. So it makes sense that if you are engaging in this data management, one of the best things that you can do is digitize your materials as soon as you collect them and start to associate them with keywords that are searchable. So if that means that you have data that's being collected within a community, maybe you have a separate file for each member of the community. And within each person's file, you have their audio transcript, you have their audio interview, you have your field notes for that person, you have your observations of them, all in one folder. And then you have another folder for each person. And each folder is labeled in a way that's unique, that helps you identify who's who, but is also maintaining the confidentiality of your participants. So maybe it's like, oh, I'm going to label my participants by the first two letters of their first name and the first two letters of their last name, and that's their code. So that way you're protecting the confidentiality and the privacy of that individual while still being able to search for, oh, I remember I did this interview with Joe and I know Joe's file is this because it matches his name or it makes sense for who he is. So immediately digitizing your information is important in order to really give yourself an opportunity to streamline the analysis process. It is also better to store your data in universal formats. So as college students and as graduate students, you have access to a lot of software that's available at CSU that might be under a license. So when you graduate, you may lose access to that software program. And if your data is stored in that program in only a file that is unique to that program, you could lose access to your data. So it's important to store your data in a universal format, such as a text file for words, or a CSV file for numbers, or even JPEGs for images, so that you can still access that information after you leave. And also, it's your responsibility as a qualitative researcher to be informed on the best practices for archiving data, because those policies change, those best practices alter over time, and it's your responsibility as the researcher to know what direction you need to go into. And in some settings, data collection through direct contact with humans may be impossible or deemed unnecessary. And that means the data can be recorded through other means. So I want to take some time to talk about what some of those other means are. One of those is artifacts. And artifacts are everything people create. This can be arts and crafts, tools, technology, even their trash, just to name some examples. And these artifacts could be common and used daily, or they could be special and used in rituals. And these objects, these artifacts, can tell researchers that they existed in a particular place and time, and that they were used by a specific group of people. So that gives us information about what purpose these artifacts serve for individuals. But also, objects can tell researchers about the social structures, either in the past or in the present. And if they have objects from across time about social and cultural change, we can really start to see how artifacts will change. And some objects can be collected, but some objects cannot be brought back from the field. And they must be recorded in detail or through images to be studied later. So think about the example of cultural ruins. You can't pack up an entire civilization and bring it back to your office and study it. So you have to document it in some other way, because this object is important for the research that you're doing, but you can't bring it with you. You can't hold it all the time. So you have to study it in another way, which leads us into our second other form of qualitative data, which is images. One reason that oftentimes researchers will photograph people and objects, as well as their actions and their interactions, is so that you can document their existence and their variety. When you create an image of something or someone, you can really start to document how they are so unique and how they are similar to and different from others, and you can see them in context. You can really get to see the experience of the person, because rarely when you're doing this research you are looking at just the person in the image. You might be looking at the things in the background, the context in which you took the picture. Another reason to utilize images is to record details that might escape you as a researcher in the field, but can be studied back in the lab when there's more time and more context that has been gained for the information that you've gathered. To make sense of the details experienced in the field, you get to put them in context. So the way that I like to think about this is that when you're sometimes doing an intake with a client, like a therapy client, maybe they say something and you really remember that piece, and then you go back and you watch your recording, you're like, oh my God, this person said this thing. I didn't even catch that in the interview or in the intake. And that's the idea with these images as well, that you're getting this opportunity to see the information in a different light and to provide context to it. And researchers can, but do not have to take the photos themselves. They can collect images such as magazine covers or whatever visual materials exist on the research subject. In projects examining areas of people's lives that are difficult to do participant observation in, such as like seeing someone in their home for 24 hours, researchers might ask the informants to take and submit photos of themselves and their surroundings. So there's a little bit of variation in how you collect these images. But you can also engage in indirect observations that are all of these forms of observations that come from the environment, such as photographs, videos, and artifacts, but not directly from the participants. So you're engaging in these indirect observations where you can get a feel for what is going on in the environment without directly interacting with the participants. So just going through and almost engaging in participant observation by taking photos, taking videos, and gathering artifacts without that direct communication. Sometimes still images are not enough in qualitative research, and researchers need moving images or videos. In the lab and field settings, video recordings can lead to important insights that might be missed otherwise. Researchers often capture more data in a video than they do in a photo, but they have to think about where to place the camera. So it's really important to keep in mind what information you need to gather about a group, and then be strategic in where you gather that information, where you set the camera or the video recording software. And video recordings are also helpful in collaborative research when not everyone will be on site to do direct observation. If you have multiple researchers on a qualitative project, you might do video recording so that each person can observe what each researcher did without actually having to be there, which can then decrease the amount of time and cost to the researchers. And we must consider the role that documents play in qualitative research, because qualitative research can take place in the archives, going through historical data, newspapers, library resources, court records, even community records like city hall records. Sometimes these records, a lot of times, are digital or are being digitized, which makes them more accessible through research libraries and may provide a useful source of information for the research that we're doing. And a clearly defined, comprehensive, and well-maintained digital archive allows for you as a researcher to have good control in your sampling, as well as creating more control for replicating your study. So there is a tremendous benefit to doing these document or archival qualitative research studies. Even though they might not be everyone's cup of tea, they do serve quite an important purpose. And sometimes it's important to keep in mind that we don't always have these clear delineations between qualitative and quantitative research. And when that happens, we have mixed methods designs. And these mixed method designs are combining methods of direct observation, such as participant observation and ethnographic interviews, with these unobtrusive collection of objects, images, and more. It can be a fun and powerful tool in the research that we do. Research projects that use mixed methods can generate more robust data about what we are studying, and it can also be used to correct impressions gained from single viewpoints. If we are collecting data in multiple ways, we're putting the data in context in a more comprehensive way that can't be gathered if we're only going in from participant observation or only going in from a quantitative approach. So that is where we are going to wrap up our lecture on chapter 11. Join me for the lecture on chapter 12, where we're going to continue talking about qualitative data. I will see you all in the next lecture.